Good afternoon. Welcome to the second of our three-part series on what Jewish texts say about gender, ethics, and power. There are teachers that you have along your way that you know you want to have not just teach to you, but bring back to your community. And that is the case with Rabbi Sarah Mulhern and myself. I first learned with her through the Hartman Institute, and just knew that I had to bring her to our community. And I'm so happy that she's with us for this month. Rabbi Mulhern serves at Base LNCLN, a Jewish home for college students and young adults in Chicago. She's also a faculty member at the Shalom Hartman Institute, which is where I met her, where she led the Created Equal project on topics related to gender, ethical leadership, and moral use of power. She was ordained by the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College and received private rabbinic ordination from Rabbi Daniel Landes with a master's in Jewish education from Hebrew College. She's an alumna of Yeshivat Hadar, Pardes Institute, Drisha Institute, Beit Midrash Har, Brandeis University, and the Wexner Graduate Fellowship, and lives in Chicago with her husband, Rabbi William Friedman, and their children. And I'll tell you that Sarah's helped me navigate difficult texts and situations and figuring out how to articulate in 2021 this interwoven nature of gender and ethics and power. She has a unique, I think, and special hold on that market and that niche, and just love learning with her. And so, Rabbi, I'll pass things over to you, and welcome again.
Thanks, Rabbi Jessica. Really nice to be back. Nice to see some returning faces and some new faces. So just picking up from where we were in our last session, last time we really thought together about what are the stories that we and other people in our community have carry sort of deeply in our minds and hearts about who looks like a leader and how those people should behave. And we really thought about that in terms of sort of our gendered expectations of who should be a leader and how they should behave, and also all sorts of other categories. And we really talked together about how we, as members of Jewish communities, can support our communities and our leaders in the work of expanding those stories, to be more expansive about who we can sort of imagine in our leadership, and also to be more expansive in terms of the ways in which they lead. And we thought about how that work might benefit our communities, the ways in which it might challenge our communities. And I learned a great deal from each of you in that conversation. And today what I want to do is really continue with what to me feels like a deeply related question. And for me, it's a question about the pandemic, but also about the moment, the sort of extended moment that we're living through in terms of the ways in which gender norms and sort of the rules of social engagement around gender have changed so much. Certainly over the courses of the last really several decades. So I want to think about that. I want to think about, in this time where there has been so much change and so much social upheaval, what is it that we really need from our leaders? What is it that we as community members demand from them? And in particular, I'm thinking about, as things change so much, as the rules of engagement change so much, when do we need them to help us feel grounded, to help us draw lines of continuity to the past, to fight, to preserve what was good about how we used to do things, and to center the values that have always guided us? And when, on the other hand, do we need them to sort of jump into the fray and to quickly adapt to meet new realities, and to experiment and to sort of free themselves and to free us and our communities of old patterns and old models that aren't working for us anymore, don't serve us in change times? So in short, so when do we ask of our leaders, please, focus on stability, focus on continuity, and when do we ask on them, please be responsive, be radical and creative? And either way, whichever path we sort of hope our leaders take, what can we be doing to participate that and to support them? So like last time, we're going to think about these important, timely questions by digging into some Jewish texts and some other texts. First, I just want to share a couple of sort of small quotes that really frame how I'm thinking about this issue. And then we're going to move into some rabbinic texts, first of which I think give some really beautiful literary texture to these questions, and the second set of which really represent the sort of paradigmatic talmudic case study of this question of when to jump into change and when to resist it. And my hope is that through exploring those texts, we can really add some depth and some Jewish wisdom to the consideration that we bring to this topic that is so timely and so relevant to our own experiences. So far, just before I dive in, any clarification that anybody needs? Everybody feels okay? Okay, seeing some nods. Okay, great. So I want to just start with a couple of modern texts that are helping me think about sort of how do I orient myself to the specific moment we're in terms of the pandemic, and also to sort of being born in this millennia with this moment of tremendous gender and cultural change. So the first text I want to show, and I'll share a screen and show it to you all. Can everybody see text 1 here? Yeah? Okay.
Yes,
so
yes.
This great. So this first text that I want to share is from Anna Muller, and she was in 1998 a PhD student. She was working on her dissertation at Leo Baeck College, and she was asked to write an essay for a journal on the topic of tradition and change. And she wrote something sort of a creative answer to the question, and I think it's just so beautiful in its simplicity. So I want to read it. Here's what she wrote. Compared with the past and probably all the future, the present time is as good or as bad as any other. The only essential difference is that the present time is our time, my time, and in that way is the only chance to interfere actively with world events. And that is where I see the difficulty. How do I arrive in my own time, my present? How can I be at home in it and yet keep enough distance, like a painter with his canvas, to recognize and to decide what I want to do with the present? So I love this. I think it just really gets to the heart of the matter, right? So Anna Muller, she's a German Jew. She goes on to be a Holocaust historian. So I don't think she really means that there aren't worse circumstances and less painful ones, right? She knows that some times are better and worse in that sense. But there's something very powerful about her kind of getting to the core of saying, yes, some moments are more comfortable and some are more painful, but the essential thing that really differentiates now from all the moments that came before and all the moments that will come in the future is really just that this is the only moment we can act in. It was like sort of very meditative about the way she approaches this. And I love her description that the desired posture is one of being both fully in the time we're in and somehow also with enough, I think literally enough artistic difference to make, artistic distance to make conscious decisions about how we're going to use the great gift of the fact that we can act in this present moment. No, we might not like the circumstances, we might love them, but whatever it is, this is the time that we have to be human in and to do in. And just to share sort of one more quote on this theme, I think apparently I wanted to fully display how cool I am. And so I have to share that this idea shows up also in the sort of classic fantasy novel, The Lord of the Rings, which some of you may know and some of you may not know, but this is an exchange between two key characters really at the beginning of this long series of events. And one of them, Gandalf, has just explained to the other, Frodo, that evil forces are beginning to gather in the world and there's going to be a war. And unavoidably, through no fault of his own, this poor guy, Frodo, is really going to be in the thick of it. And he says, I wish none of this had happened. And Gandalf says, so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to do to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. So this really is kind of how I'm thinking, which is, I wish COVID had not happened, or that if the virus had to take off, that we would have responded more effectively as a nation and a world to the virus. I do feel great about all the changes in our culture around around gender and the range of expression for people of different genders that are acceptable. And I think it's great the way the norms have changed around the sort of terms of engagement between people of different genders. But whether or not I like the changes that are rocking the boat of my life, fundamentally, I don't have any control over the way that cultures are shifting. I don't have any control over the virus. And so, here I am. I'm in the present, and this is the only moment in which I have any ability to act. And so I think, despite my urge to try and want to change the paths more to my liking or less to my liking, in fact, the only appropriate question as a human being, and certainly as someone with leadership responsibilities and resources and the ability to push other people with leadership responsibilities and resources, the only real question is, okay, how do I be both fully present in this moment and also somehow create enough critical distance to make good decisions about what to do with the set of circumstances that I have been given? So there are two other texts here that I want to share. And these texts are midrashim, rabbinic interpretations on the book of Esther, on Megillat Esther, the story that we read on Purim. And what I love about them, before I show them to you, is that they are both analyzing the exact same historical moment or literary moment, whatever you want to say. They have the same data, right? Both of these midrashim are looking at the exact same verses in the book of Esther, which is sort of analyzing the different steps and moments that lead up to the Jews being saved from Haman by Esther. And yet, despite the fact that they have exactly the same data, they arrive at completely opposite conclusions. So let me show you these texts because I think it's just fascinating. So this first one is from the Jerusalem Talmud. So folks may or may not be familiar with the fact that there are actually two Talmuds. One is created in what is now Iraq, in Babylonia, and one is created in the land of Israel. And this is from that version. So this text is from, let's say, the 5th century. And this is how it relates to and tells the story of the book of Esther. So let me read it for you. Rabbi Chia, the son of Abba, and Rabbi Shimon, the son of Halafta, were walking in the Arbel Valley in Israel, and at the break of morning before the light of day. So they're on some sort of sunrise hike. And they watched the dawn as the light began to shine. And Rabbi Chia said to him, to Rabbi Shimon, so too is the redemption of Israel. In the beginning, little by little, and the more it progresses, it increases and grows. As it is written, when I dwell in darkness, God is my light. And so, in the beginning, and Mordecai sat at the gate of the king. And afterwards, and Haman took the royal garb and the horse. And afterwards, Mordecai returned to the gate of the king. And afterwards, Mordecai went out before the king in royal garb. And afterwards, the Jews had light and joy. So, in other words, what's happening here? What's the story in the telling of this midrash? This text sees all the small steps leading up to the Jews being saved, right, as a process, right? First he goes to the door, and then he gets the horse, and then, right, little by little by little as a process, and emphasizes that the redemption, right, is always a process, right? That change, in this case, beautiful, positive, redemptive change, is always a series of small steps, like a sunrise, right? If you're watching a sunrise, there's no clear moment where a light switch comes on, right? In our homes, it's dark and then you flip the switch and then it's light. But in nature, the sun, right, gently, starting very slowly, it gets a little bit less dark and a little bit less dark, right? Almost imperceptibly. And each step builds on the one before and more until it's full daylight, right? So this text looks at the process of redemption and says it's like that. Little by little by little by little until, without even noticing, you're in sunlight. The second midrash, again, looks at exactly the same text and has a completely different read, right? So this is from a later midrash. It's from an 11th century midrashic collection, Midrash Lekach Tov, and it says, no, exactly the opposite. So, right, again, Mordechai went exactly, we were commenting on exactly the same verses. Rav said that he spent the first day of Pesach fasting, okay? And so on the 13th of Nisan, the letters went out, or were written, and on that day, Mordechai tore his garments, and then they proclaimed the fast, and that day and the next 2 days after that, right? So they're trying to calculate where, because the book of Esther doesn't give us dates, like what were the dates for each of the events in the story? So on the first day of Pesach, they fasted. On the third day was the fast of Esther. And then on the third day, Esther wore royal garb. And then it was on that day, which she said, let the king and Haman come and hurry Haman to do the word of Esther. What is your question? This teaches that she did not eat until Ahasuerus said to her, what is your question? And he said, hurry Haman. Okay, so we don't need to worry about like sort of all the pieces of the story, but the point is that the Midrash is mapping out all the different events of the book of Esther onto different dates in the month of Nisan, right? Haman was hanged on the 16th of Nisan. His decree lasted only 2 days, and on the third day he was hung. The king's slumber was interrupted on the first night of Pesach. Okay, so basically they're doing all the math, and unlike in the first Midrash, they're coming to the conclusion that the whole story of the book of Esther takes place over 3 days, from the 13th to the 16th of Nisan. And then they sort of sum it up. God's salvation happens in a flash, right? So it's actually the exact opposite metaphor of the last story, right? The last story used a metaphor of a sunrise where the light increases slowly, slowly, slowly. And this Midrash looks at the exact same story and says, it's only 3 days, right? In the course of a human life, in the course of human history, 3 days is equivalent to a light switch. It's like a flash. It's like an explosion from darkness to total light, right? So looking again at the exact same data, and instead of telling a story of a process that slowly builds, tells a story that redemption is something that happens in a flash, in what basically amounts to sort of one dramatic moment. And to me, I think this is just a beautiful literary look at the fact that although we may all be in some literal sense, right? It's all of us are living in January 2022, right? We're all living in the exact same moment. But because of differences in our circumstances and our perspectives, and because of the very nature of human subjectivity, right, we all actually understand and therefore experience the nature of our time totally differently, right? So in terms of changes around gender, because that's sort of the topic that Rabbi Jessica asked me to focus on, I think there are definitely people in our communities and our cultures who feel like this is moving very slowly, right? The women of the suffragists, it's like 100+ years ago, and the feminist movement starts already in the 60s, and like we aren't even where we want to be, and it's like a slow, gradual process to a time where every person is treated with equality and treated with respect, no matter their gender and their gender expression. And I think there are other people who are living through the exact same moment in time, and they're feeling like, oh my God, everything just changed overnight. What are you talking about? It all happened in a flash. And we're looking at the same data, but because we're different people in different perspectives, it feels, either like this sort of long, slow, gradual, almost imperceptible change towards redemption, or it feels like, oh my gosh, the world just blew up with a huge flash of light and everything changed overnight. And we could use different examples, I think, also in terms of all the cultural changes around the pandemic. Some people want to tell that story as like the pandemic came and changed everything. And other people want to tell that story as, all these changes had been building anyways, and it just sort of took things to the next level. And so I just want to kind of leave this on the table as a question to ponder, as you think about the changes that you've experienced in the world, in American culture, in the culture of the community, right, of the temple itself, in so many different areas. Do you feel like it's been this sort of long, slow process, or do you feel like it's been a sudden shift? Or maybe to ask it with more nuance, right? When you look around and you see the world today and the ways in which it's different for all of us than the world in which we were born, which of those differences feel to you as if they were a slow build? And which of those feel like they happened suddenly? And if they happened suddenly, sort of what were the moments where you suddenly sort of felt them or saw them for the first time? So I don't. Yeah, sorry, was someone?
Do you want to? Yeah, I think there was one hand up, and I'll just say,
great.
quickly, and we'll keep our comments short. I've been thinking about it, especially with what happened in Texas this weekend, and also with the environment, where people, I feel like everyone wants us to change, or people in the know, or people who are knowledgeable, or people who are wise about these things, want us to change our thinking from like, stop acting surprised when you hear the environment's changing, or stop acting surprised when you hear an event like that happens. Like, be shocked at what's going on, but there's no reason to be surprised anymore. Like, we've been given preparation and information and, and resources to like rethink. And I think that's where it relates to your question. We're like, for those who act surprised, like, oh my God, women want this, or you want that, or, and you're like, I've been asking this forever, but if you're the asker, then of course it feels like forever if it's new to you. And I think like that's when the big change happens, when we stop. And a lot of pundits have written about Coleyville in the last few days, like, stop being surprised about this. Like, this is happening, and it's a matter of shifting like how we deal with the surprise, but still, being shocked and hopeful those things don't happen. And I feel like the same dialogue is going on with the environment. Like, stop being surprised that it's the warmest year on record and this and that, and make concrete changes. And I think that's almost the bigger shift. And it's weird to live through these shifts. Lorraine, I saw did you have your hand up too? No? Okay. Go ahead. Oh, Judy, go ahead.
I agree with everything Rabbi Jessica just said. I know we were warned, just again, talking about the pandemic, we were warned years ago. It's called COVID-19 because that's when it all became aware to us. Scientists knew this was coming, and it crept up on us, we thought, and now it's exploded in front of us. So it's a combination of both. It was happening, and it did explode in front of us as the numbers and all scare us all and blah, blah, blah. But I found on a personal level, everything you just said, Rabbi, applied to, I'm going through physical difficulties. And I get very impatient because I'm not finding the magic wand quickly. But I also feel that to keep away the darkness, I have to keep looking for that light. So everything you said applied to me personally, but I agree with everything Rabbi Jessica said.
Yeah, I think that's so beautiful, Judy. And I think it pushes towards a question, which is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of sort of living in each of these two models? Actually, like, sometimes there's real power in kind of noticing that almost everything in life is a process, right? Physical, moving towards health, physical, moving away from health. Usually neither of those things happen in a flash. Social change, cultural change, all of these things are processes. And sometimes there's a real wisdom and power that can be gained if we can sort of see the very small changes and how they're building up over time. And on the other hand, as Rabbi Jessica pointed out, like, sometimes things only really change when we are able to create those flash moments. Even if, in fact, actually, I think about something like Rosa Parks on the bus, which I think most of us remember in our culture, that moment of refusal to stand up as a flash moment, like a moment in which many things changed. But in fact, she had been training as an activist for years. The work that went into building that bus boycott had been going on for years. And so I think a lot about like what, when we even, to use the example of, I struggle with chronic pain. When I go to the doctor, when do I tell a story of like, things have been getting a little bit harder and a little bit harder and a little bit harder over time? And when do I get their attention by being like, bam, flash, this really bad thing happened? So I think, both in our personal lives and in our culture change, there's like wisdom to be gained from sort of watching a process. And there's also power to sometimes telling the story as like, salvation can come in a flash. And so I think, in that context, that really leads to the sort of questions about, okay, like we're in this time, it's 2022. There's lots of things that maybe are good about it and better about it than, 1922. And there are many things that are hard about it and maybe less good. But it's the one we have. And that brings me sort of to the question I started with, which is, okay, we're living in this time of tremendous change, good change and bad change. And we're, our charge, I think, as human beings and as Jews is not just to live through the time, but actually to, live in it. Not just to sort of get through it, but to sort of participate in it. And given that, sort of, what do we actually want to do for our Jewish community, and what do we want to ask from our rabbis and from our Jewish leaders right now? And there's lots of different kinds of ways in which we could ask that question, but the one that I've been thinking about and want to bring today is the one I started with, right? Do we want our leaders in this time to put most of their energies into creating through lines and stability for us and preserving that was good from what we had before and helping us feel held and rooted? Or do we want them to sort of jump into the fray and make even more changes to how they work and how they lead and how our community operates to sort of get ahead of the changes and meet the needs of the moment? And maybe we even want them to push us in ways that might be uncomfortable and we might not be totally ready for, but to push us to adapt in ways that maybe we need to continue to thrive as a Jewish community. And obviously I'm phrasing this as like a binary, like a this or that. But in fact, really, like most things, the answer is going to be, a mix. And so, how do we help our leaders and how do we as community members sort of figure out, when do we do the sort of jumping in and making change, and when do we do the sort of through line drawing? How do we support our leaders in our communities in making these decisions? And I think to some degree, this is going to be a personality question and a question about the strength of any given community or any given leader. But I hope that in large part, it's a question that is mostly answered by what the people, what we, the members of this community, need in this time. So that's the question I want to get at with this next set of texts. Just checking back in. Everybody feel like we understand the question and where we're going with it? Get some nods. Okay, great. So I want to bring up what I'm calling a sort of talmudic case study here of text, where the rabbis are really looking at exactly this question. When do we focus on like, okay, the times are changing, jump into the fray, and when do we say times are changing, let's preserve what's good? And I think I've heard a lot of my own voice. Can I ask someone actually to read this first text from the Babylonian Talmud in Brachot? Anybody willing to read for me? Just in English. Yeah, Judy, can you come off mute and read? With you, I think you need to come off mute, and I will be interrupting you to explain. Okay. So,
and the verse states, "It is time to work for the Lord. They have made void your Torah." Psalm 119.
Okay. Great. I'll pause you right there. So we have this verse from the book of Psalms, right? And it says, "Eid lasot l'Hashem," it's a time to work for God. And it also says, "Hafiru Toratecha." They have made void, or maybe they are going to make void, your Torah. Now, the problem is it's not clear, like, what's the relationship between the first part and the second part? Is it that they made void your Torah and therefore it's time to work for the Lord? Are they two separate ideas? Or it's time to work for the Lord through making void? Like, it's not clear, right? We have two ideas. God needs something from us and people uprooting Torah, but we don't know what's the relationship between the two parts of the verse. So the Talmud here is going to try and offer two different ways of understanding what's the relationship between the first part of the verse, God needs us, and the second part of the verse, people are undermining Torah. Okay, so far we understand what the interpretive challenge is here? Great, so keep reading, Judy.
Of this, Rava said, this verse can be interpreted from beginning to end, and it can be interpreted from end to beginning. Read from the beginning to the end, it is interpreted. It is time to work for the Lord. What is the reason? Because they have made void your Torah, so it must be remedied.
Okay, great. So interpretation number one is, what's the relationship between these two ideas? The the second part is the cause of the first part, right? The people have made void your Torah. The people are undermining Torah, and therefore you must act for God in order to fix things, right? So this is a very lower C conservative way to understand the story. The story is there is this thing called the Torah. People are undermining it, and therefore you have to get out there, for God and restore things to how they were before, fix the problem, okay? That's the first interpretation. What's the second interpretation, Judy?
Read from end to beginning is interpreted. They have made void your Torah. What is the reason? Because it is time to work for the Lord.
Okay, so this interpretation is totally the opposite, right? And it's very radical. It says, the story is they made void Torah in order to work for the Lord, right? Something is going on, and that what God needs of us in this moment is to nullify Torah, right? So for some reason, something is happening, and what God needs of us is to break the old rule, to uproot the Torah, okay? So again, we're looking at exactly the same data, one verse in Psalms, and one interpretation says this is a story about the conservative impulse, right? The Torah is being uprooted, our way of life is being undermined. So what God needs us to do is to jump in and fix that. And the other interpretation of the exact same words is the complete opposite, right? Something is going on in the world, and in order to do for God, in order to advance what we believe in, we have to blow up that which used to be holy, right? We have to undermine Torah actively in order to preserve God. Okay, so we have these two really different interpretations. People generally, right, we're feeling okay, we understand the two different interpretations? Okay, and I think what is really interesting here, right, is that we have these two different interpretations of the verse, but they're actually sort of two different stories about what rabbinic leadership should do, right? Is the community in need at a time when the community is sort of falling apart and undermining Torah? Do we need our rabbis and our leaders to come in and sort of set us back on the straight and narrow? Or is it the opposite? At a time where things are sort of falling apart, do we need our rabbis to come in and sort of blow up the way that they used to do things and do something really different? And what I think is so interesting is that this is a literary section of the Talmud, right? They're interpreting a verse, they're playing with different interpretations, and it could have just stayed there. But in fact, actually, the rabbis use this for legal interpretation. They're going to actually use these two different interpretations and say, because of this interpretation of the verse, I acted in such and such a way. So it's not just in the Beit Midrash, in the conceptual world. I'm actually going to show you examples of the rabbis using this same text, either to justify a very conservative sort of preservationist way of behaving, or to justify a really radical way of behaving. Right, so it's going to be in the real world with real stakes. Okay, so let's look at the first example, where we're going to see the rabbis using this kind of conservative lower C interpretation to justify a kind of a preservationist way of acting. Natalie, just because I see you, would you be willing to read this next text 6? And while you come off mute, I'll say this is from the Tosefta. So this is a rabbinic text from probably the 1st or 2nd century in the land of Israel. And it's going to use our exact same verse. So Natalie, please read, and I apologize in advance for interrupting you.
Hillel the elder says, at the time when they gather in, you should spread. And at the time when they spread, you should gather in. At the time that you see that the Torah is beloved to all of the Jewish people and everyone rejoices in it, you should spread, that is, teach it, as it is said. The one that spreads gathers in more, Proverbs 11:24. And at the time that you see that the Torah is being forgotten from the Jewish people and no one is paying attention to it, gather it in. Learn it privately to yourself and do not teach, as it is said. It is time to do for Hashem, for they have forsaken your Torah.
Okay, so this is a very interesting text, right? So Hillel, the sort of beloved Hillel, the one who, when the convert came to him, stood on one foot and said, you know, this very welcoming, loving guy. Here he comes off a little bit differently. He says, you know, if the Jewish people are excited about Torah, like, great, that, you know, your job is to get out there and teach to the people who are excited and, like, spread Torah as much as you can, like, you know, take out ads on the side of the freeway and, you know, get Torah out there because people are excited. But also he says the opposite, right? If people are forgetting Torah and they're neglecting it, they're not paying attention to it, don't chase them, right? Don't try and chase after them and convince them to like Torah. Just sort of gather, you know, either by yourself or with your small circle of students and learn Torah with the people who are into it, but don't try to teach publicly. You know, don't try to get it out there. I taught this text to a group of Hillel professionals and they were horrified, right? Because this is, you know, as, you know, I'm in the line of business of engagement. And what I do as a rabbi is try and find people who are not yet excited about Torah and get them excited about it. But Hillel is saying, look, if people are forgetting Torah and they're not really paying attention to it, like, don't chase them down. Just like learn by yourself until, you know, just keep it with in the small circle. And so the question is why? And it seems like, you know, based on the verse that he uses to justify it, it's a time to do for God. They are forsaking your Torah, right? He seems to basically be saying that it's dangerous to get out there and teach Torah to people who don't value Torah, that something about the content of the Torah is going to get degraded or confused, right? If you're going to try too hard to sort of translate Torah in a way that makes it like sexy and appealing to people who don't care about Torah, you're going to actually kind of get too far away from what Torah was about. You're going to misapply it and stretch it too thin. And he says, it's just not worth it. If people aren't excited, kind of, you know, hunker down and keep Torah strong. And then, you know, maybe someday they'll come back and they'll be ready for it. And when they are, Torah will be there. So, you know, we may agree with this, we may not agree with this, but what I just want to show you is that he is doing something that is very conservative and like controversially so, right? Because there are other rabbis who say, like, if, you know, Torah is the most important thing in the world, if people don't care about it, get out there and convince them to care about it. And he's saying, like, no, I'm going to bide my time. I'm going to keep preserving this knowledge and wait until people come to me. Like, that's not a popular opinion. And he's justifying it saying, you know, it's a time to do for God. People are forsaking the Torah. And so, like, this is my sort of course correction. I'm going to keep the thing that is good, and I'm going to wait until, you know, it circles back around. So that's one, right? That's one very conservative impulse, which says, like, I have this thing that's good. Times have changed, but I don't really care. I'm going to keep doing the thing because I know it's the right thing. And maybe it will, you know, people will come back to me and maybe they won't, but I'm not adapting my thing that I know is good and true to make it popular in this new circumstance. I'm just sticking with what I know is right. So that's one voice. But what's interesting is we're going to see in this next text, the exact opposite voice using, again, the same proof text. So let me read here from the Babylonian Talmud. So again, now we're skipping forward a few hundred years. And here we have a story about sort of what will seem to us to be silly, but will seem to the authors of this text to be a radical innovation. So Rabbi Yehuda Bar Nachmani, the Meturgaman of Reish Lakish, expounded. Now you're all wondering what the heck is a Meturgaman, Rabbi Sarah? Why did you not translate that weird word? So a Meturgaman is a role that existed in rabbinic culture, particularly in early rabbinic culture, because they learned orally, right? They didn't write their Torah down. And so a Meturgaman is like a human tape recorder. He follows around a great rabbi and he memorizes all of the teachings that person says, and then he goes and tells them to other people, right? They're not writing down the wisdom of Reish Lakish. So this guy, Yehuda Bar Nachmani, is just following Reish Lakish around, memorizing his Torah, and then sharing it out with the community. And in that way, the Meturgaman is sort of a really important role, right? He is the mechanism by which Torah gets preserved and by which it gets spread. So he is now going to teach his own Torah, and here is the Torah that the Meturgaman wants to share. So he says, one verse in the Torah says, write you these words. And another verse says, and it's actually a second part of the same verse, by the mouth of these words, right? So he's focusing on the use of the word the mouth. And this tells you, the contrast of the mouth versus writing. This tells you that words that were taught orally, you may not recite in writing, and words that were written, you may not recite orally. So just interesting, like just to imagine that a person who's so in an oral learning culture is using the word recite even to talk about writing, right? But he says, okay, we have a rule. The written Torah, right, the text of the Chumash that we read from the Sefer, from the scroll in synagogue, it's written and you're not allowed to study it from memory or just to be discussing it, right? Presumably the concern here is something about precision, right? If you're going to study the text of the Bible, you have to have the text of the Bible in front of you, right? You have to be looking at a scroll. But on the other hand, if you're going to study rabbinic Torah, right, so the teachings of the rabbis, which I just told you are not written down, it's not only that they're not written down, you're actually not allowed to write them down. It is forbidden to write them down. And so presumably the concern here is something about creativity, right? That rabbinic Torah is not meant to be a book that you take off the shelf and you read precisely the same exact words every time. It's supposed to feel like a conversation, right? I've taught this text before, but every time I teach it, it's a little bit different, right? Because I'm not reading off a script. We're like reading it together. We're discussing. There's different people in the room, right? So something about sort of the creativity of rabbinic interpretation, both legal and literary, that experience is not supposed to be dried up and pinned down to something you could write down. You have to memorize it and discuss it orally. The school of Rabbi Ishmael is going to bring just another proof for the same idea. The word these in the commandment, write these words, serves to emphasize these words. In other words, the written Torah you may write, but you may not write halachot, i.e. the oral Torah, rabbinic material. Okay, so this is the rule. This is the law. The law is, and was for many hundreds of years, that you have to study biblical texts in writing, and you have to study rabbinic material orally. And this is how rabbinic culture learned. They engaged with most of their learning through speech, through memorization and discussion. And to write that material down would have been considered not just different, but actually wrong, actually a violation of this sort of core tenet of this learning culture, which is, presumably about creativity, about relationships between specific individuals and their students, and not the kind of thing that you would commit to writing, right? That's the rule. Everybody agrees that's the rule. It's not just a rule. It's like a foundational rule of how we do our thing in the rabbinic period, right? And then change, right? Change comes along. So they asked, perhaps for a new matter, it is different. A proof for this suggestion is that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish would read from a scroll of rabbinic Agadah on Shabbat. Agadah is rabbinic story. So Reish Lakish, the same Reish Lakish who the Meturgaman was following around in order to memorize his teaching, apparently he had a scroll with rabbinic stories. He and his chavruta, his study partner, Rabbi Yochanan, had a physical scroll. They don't have books yet, but a scroll with rabbinic stories written down in it. And that's a problem, because didn't we just say that it is forbidden to create such a thing? So how could it be that these two great respected rabbis, the same rabbi who's the teacher of the previous speaker, are going around doing something that we all know is totally against the rules? And so we asked them, what the heck are you doing, guys? And they say as follows. They explain themselves as follows. It is a time to do for the Lord. They have made void your Torah. In other words, Torah, rabbinic material, these stories are precious to us, and they're being forgotten, or they're being misinterpreted or misremembered. And so we have to do for God. We have to do for God, save these stories And the way that we're going to save these stories is by breaking the rules, right? They said it is better to uproot Torah than for Torah to be forgotten from the Jewish people. So interesting, right? It is better to break Torah rules about how we learn and teach Torah than for people to forget this material that is so precious to us. So there it's the total opposite, right? They're using the exact same verse to justify something that to us maybe seems kind of silly, like writing things down in a book is your sort of big, scary move. But actually for them, it's a huge cultural break around the very nature of what it is that they're doing when they're learning and teaching. And they're saying, yes, we're going to blow up this like really core part of how we learned and taught and did Jewish before, because otherwise people are going to forget Torah. And you know what? New times, new circumstances, we have to do our thing in a different way. And that is the definition of radical, right? To say, yeah, that was good, that was precious, it was a great way of doing for however long, but it's not working anymore. People need something different. We're blowing up the whole thing. So I think that these two texts side by side is just a great illustration of the tension. And I really do mean tension, because I don't think anyone's going to say like, yeah, that's it. Like I pick one side of this. You know, my job in this moment of change is 100% to conserve everything, and I'm not going to make any adaptive moves at all. And I don't think anyone else is going to say, you know, my job at this moment is to throw out everything we did and learned from before, and I'm going to completely start from scratch on innovating a whole new kind of Judaism that has no connection to anything that was before, because it'll work better in these changed circumstances, right? Like both of those extreme positions would be silly. But I do think there's a crucial question here, which is to say, you know, we have this great civilization that we inherit and has lots of old norms in it, some of which are beautiful and healthy and serving us well, and some of which maybe are not, are damaging or hurtful. And the question is, and maybe even some of which were good in their time, but in our context are not working. And so that's the question, right? Which of these old comfortable norms do we shatter in pursuit of serving the needs of this changed moment? And actually, which of the old norms are so valuable that even if society is sort of moving past them, we sort of need to double down on them as bedrocks counterculturally at this time when everything feels unstable? So, you know, for example, I think there are some norms around gender in our community that actually maybe served us very well, you know, in the pre-modern era. And now I think which are, you know, very harmful, and it's time to move past. And there are other things that our community has historically done. And, you know, I think for myself I refrain from using my phone, to which I am completely addicted. I don't use it on Saturdays, on Shabbat. And that is like weird, right? It puts me totally out of step with the current moment and with the culture of which I'm a part. But I actually think that it's a really good kind of out of step, a really good kind of countercultural. So how do we figure out, you know, when is something that we've always done a really bad pattern that we have to break? And when do we figure out when there's something that we've always done that even though it's weird, we want to keep doing because it's a great bedrock? You know, just even thinking about this activity that we are doing right now, right? We're learning together on Zoom. And I'll say, you know, early in the pandemic, I was very resistant to switching over to learning in this new modality. I really thought it would be such a loss of the richness of learning and conversation. And yet, you know, I've benefited tremendously from being able to teach in communities all around the world and all around the country, and to being able to learn from teachers all around the country and in Israel. And I would have missed out on so much if I would have refused to adapt to this new way of learning and teaching. On the other hand, here in Chicago, I'm running a home-based Jewish community. And actually, I do insist that people are still coming to Shabbat dinners in person when we can do it safely. Because as much as I love the ways in which I've transitioned to learning and teaching in the sort of cyberspace on Zoom, I do think there are other moments in which being physically present with each other is irreplaceable, particularly in terms of what we're seeing over the past couple of years with how isolation is affecting mental health I think actually, in some ways, as much as our culture has sort of moved on to Zoom, refusing sometimes to carry on with that and to say, no, we want to be in person is more crucial than ever. But if I, completely lived in that and wasn't willing to be also in these vibrant online spaces, I would miss so much. So how do we figure out when is the moment for each one? I don't have like a perfect rubric, but I think that is the challenge that the rabbis were facing in these talmudic texts. And I think that is really the challenge of our moment. So I have about 10 minutes. I'm just going to put out some questions and then I'll open it up for any sort of comments or reflections or questions for me. Just, to get people thinking, going, what are the examples? I gave some examples from my life, but what are the examples of the things, sort of old things from before that you think are more important than ever, that we really need to fight against the cultural sands to preserve? And what are the things that we, used to do that it's really time to let go of because they're harming our communities or because we have new and better opportunities? What are the innovations that have been a wonderful step forward? And how do we think about balancing these different instincts and how do we think about balancing these different gifts and challenges? So for our last 10 minutes, I'll open it up. Any comments or questions that folks have for me or in response to those questions that I just laid out?
So in the chat, someone put something about Coleyshah and the origin of Coleyshah, and how that came to be. It's actually, it becomes an issue sometimes. So Boca, the rabbinic community, gets along tremendously well, but there's certain gatherings, like for Yom Ha'atzmaut or something like that, where like it becomes raised because we've many female cantors in the community, including here, and like who gets to decide who's being heard and who's not, whose traditions are you following?
Well, that's a great example of a norm that has already shifted tremendously. I have a whole class on this topic, so I will keep myself short, but originally in the Talmudic text, the prohibition on hearing a woman's voice did not seem to be about singing. It seems to be about a woman's speaking voice. And it seems to be an idea that men really shouldn't talk to women at all. And through sort of changing time and culture, readers of those texts came to assume that that couldn't possibly be what they meant, because of course we wouldn't want to silence women's speaking voices. And so came to think that really it was only about singing voices, particularly in the Middle Ages when singing was seen as extremely sensual. There was a lot of love songs being written in sort of the height of rabbinic or of medieval Arabic poetry. And so there's this idea that singing was very sexually provocative. And so the prohibition came to be one on women's singing voices. And now even within the Orthodox community, we actually see scholars and rabbis debating, maybe it's only like you shouldn't listen to, now I'm going to really date myself, like Britney Spears, because her music is like about sex. But actually to hear a woman cantor chanting from the Torah or singing a song of love to God actually is not even fall under the prohibition of Coleyshah at all. So this is a great example of a place where, you have this little snippet of text that says, a woman's voice is sexually provocative, and it becomes like a playing field on which different expectations about what exactly is sexually provocative and whose job it is to rein in sexual provocation and what spaces sexuality is welcome in, sort of all play out on this one little line of text as a playing field. So I know it continues to be a challenge, and particularly in pluralistic gatherings. And that to me would be a great example of a place where I would think our shifting understandings of what is sexual and also who is responsible for dealing with sexuality, the person who is supposedly being provocative or the person who is being provoked, sort of whose job it is to deal with that. As those understandings shift, I think we will see more and more shift around that topic of Coleyshah. So it's a great, relevant question.
This point and the Zoom point you brought up earlier just reminds me there's like an unnamed segment of society that will never change, and that these are non-issues for like for some people, like the gender issues or the race issues or the within Judaism issues will never change. Like that no one there, we're like, we all struggle with this stuff. And like, there's just certain segments of society or within Judaism in this particular topic that don't have zero struggle with this. Like they're not mulling on this. They're not reflecting on it. They're not like, it will never change.
I'm going to push back on you a little bit and disagree a little bit, Rabbi Jessica, which is to say, you know, I'm a part of some Orthodox spaces, and in particular, I'm a part of a educator practicum group for women who teach brides in preparation for their wedding. And I am like by far the most liberal member of the group. Most of the women in this group are ultra-Orthodox women. And you are right that in their community, the question of whether there should be very distinct roles for men and women is not on the table. And you are right that in their community, there is an expectation that women be physically modest to sort of protect men, which I find challenging. But I will also say these women are professionals. They have a lot of power and influence in their community. They are teaching very explicitly about sexuality and sexual empowerment within the context of marriage, obviously. But I think even in the Haredi ultra-Orthodox world, a lot is changing around gender. I will also say that reacting to secular society by becoming more conservative around gender is also a change, right? The sort of gender norms of my great grandmother in the shtetl in Poland were a lot more liberal than the gender norms in Brooklyn in these ultra-Orthodox communities. And that too is a kind of change in reaction to the surrounding culture. So I think you're right that they're asking really different questions, but there too, they are struggling with these questions in different forms.
It's funny. The Jewish Review of Books is like my favorite thing in the world. And I just read about this guy, Joey Rosenfeld, who's entering this neo-Hasidic space that sounds like there's a lot of stuff going on in the Orthodox world about neo-Hasidism and who's following whom and changes and people getting more traditional, like that move from modern Orthodoxy to Hasidic. Judy, I see your hand up too.
Yeah, Judy, jump in.
I'm reading the book, The Sacred Table, and that has opened up so much in my head about kashrut and all the changes and this goes back to what, the 1800s with the treif banquet and all that stuff. But the interpretations that are being accepted, I find amazing because I grew up very traditionally, and it's very hard, you know, to mix things that were always wrong. And yet I'm reading that especially the reform movement, that they're accepting more and more diversions. So it's kind of sort of what you're talking about, but this has opened, and I'm just at the beginning of the book.
Yeah, well, kashrut is such an interesting example, Judy, to bring into this conversation. You know, I'll let Jessica correct me, but my understanding is that over the history of the reform movement, actually there was originally like a total rejection of kashrut, like in Germany in the founding era of the reform movement, as sort of out of step with current ways of eating, out of step with current understandings of health, as like a part of our inheritance that like didn't make any sense to apply anymore. And in some ways there's been a coming back of like re-exploring like what parts of Jewish food culture actually have wisdom or valuable. Like, you know, I think the idea of serving shrimps at HUC, you know, at this famous treifa banquet, which may or may not, by the way, ever have happened. You know, I think a lot of Reform synagogues now are not serving bacon at Kiddush, right? Even if they're not kosher in the way that Orthodox people would think counts as kosher, many Reform Jews have like passionate engagement with beautiful thoughts about, you know, what is a Jewish food culture and what is a kashrut for our day. So I think that's a great example of a place where, you know, there's a lot of debate, like, do things change or do things stay the same, and which pieces of this practice are relevant to us and which do we let go of across the Jewish spectrum. Yeah, Jessica, do you want to add anything to what I?
No, I mean, we're kosher by the bite is our policy here, and eco kashrut I think just enters in to the conversation as well. We're out of time. I want to thank our awesome producer Jake, who's been with us and make sure that everything gets out as it should. And Rabbi, next week is your last week with us. I don't know if you want to give us a preview or.
Oh, yeah. Well, first, I just want to say thank you to everybody for great questions and for taking the time I don't know that we answered the question, but I hope we sharpened it a little in all of our mind. And then in our third week, I want to go forward into this question of, if we are wanting to move towards changes, how do we hold people through the losses that are inherent in those changes? So we're going to look at some biblical stories and some rabbinic interpretations of those stories to think about what do we do when people want to change, but there's a lot of loss involved.
Great. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Rabbi. Thanks, Jake. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week.